Okay, good morning. I hope you're all well fed after yesterday. It's not that the Gemara is so difficult. So, even if you haven't eaten so much, the Gemara is a little bit lighter than it was the previous time we met. So on the last session, we discussed a Mishnah that told us that it was a din of simcha, also on Shmini Atzeres, not just on the seventh day of Sukkot, even though the Torah in its prescription in the Psukim only details the din of Simcha for the 7 days of Sukkot. There is also a mitzvah for Shmini Atzeres as well, and the Gemara explained the source of this. It was quite a complicated brisa, if you remember, but we emerged with the knowledge that there is a din of simcha also on Shmini Atzeres. And what that meant is that in the evening of Shmini Atzeres, one should eat from a korban that was brought, a shlomim that was brought during the seventh day. You eat it in Yerushalayim in great simcha, together with wine. That's the din of samachta b'chagecha, when the Beis Hamikdash was around. And the simcha extends to the next morning as well. So even though Shmini Atzeres there's no sukkah and there's no lulav and esrog, it still has the din of simcha. That was one Mishnah and the subsequent Gemara. Then we went on to another Mishnah, and we started that Mishnah, went perhaps a little bit way through the Gemara, but I'm going to start again from the beginning of that Mishnah, which deals with how we end Yontif, the Yontif of Sukkot. What do we do with our stuff in the sukkah come towards the end of the day of the seventh day? And remember, we're here talking only about Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, we have 7 days of Sukkot, and the 8th day is Shmini Atzeres, which is also combined with Simchas Torah, and there's no 9th day at all. We're not in Chutz La'aretz. So in Eretz Yisrael, there is no din at all of the sukkah in any form or fashion on the 8th day Shmini Atzeres. There's no sort of half house solution as we have in Chutz La'aretz. There is no sukkah at all. So that's the context of the Mishnah. And we're going to pick up this Mishnah, Memchet Amud Aleph 48a. It's the Mishnah towards the middle of the page. There's one right at the top, Masni, and this Masni is what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 or 15 lines down from the top. Shiva, Sukkah Shiva Ketzad, which is a strange way to phrase a Mishnah because it seems very, very straightforward. What does it mean, a Sukkah that lasts 7 days? Ketzad, what does that mean? And here, as we'll see from the Mishnah's answer itself, the Mishnah itself is asking the question and then coming up with an answer. It's this sort of the method by which the Mishnah expresses itself, which is in a sense easier for us to get to grip with than a straightforward statement. The question is asked, what does it mean 7 days of Sukkot? What actually happens on the seventh day to bring it to an end? Ketzad, how should we deal with the situation on the seventh day? How do we begin our preparations of emerging from Sukkot? That's essentially the question being asked. So the Mishnah itself now answers that question. Gama melechel, once he's eaten his final seudah on the seventh day, which could be his lunch or it could be something he eats later on in the afternoon, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, and he's decided that he is not going to eat anymore in the Sukkah. So one of the main mitzvot hayom of eating and sleeping in the sukkah, probably he feels all that is over for him. The sukkah is still up, obviously. He's not going to take a hammer and nails on the 7th day of sukkah, which is a yontif. Lo yatir sukkato, says the Mishnah. He's not allowed to dismantle his sukkah, even if he were to do so in a way that wasn't necessarily muktzah. He's not allowed to do that. We're not even just talking here about using tools. But simply, if he were to do some dismantling process, and it's still the 7th day of Sukkot, it hasn't quite reached nightfall, which would see the income of Shmini Atzeres, it would be a bizoyon, a disgrace to the last few hours of the festival of Sukkot if he were to commence dismantling the Sukkah, even if he were to do so in a way that didn't transgress any malacha. So he's not allowed to do that. But what is he allowed to do? Instead, avol, said the Mishnah, Morid es hakelim, min ha-mincha ulamala, from mincha time and onwards, which is, in the way the Mishnah is looking to about 2.5 hours before nightfall, late in the afternoon, the second half of the afternoon, he may take down his kalim. Take down means take them out of the sukkah. If the sukkah was on the roof, it literally means take down the kalim. That's the context normally of building a sukkah in Yerushalayim around the time at which the Mishnah is speaking. But he would take them. He can take them into the house because he's likely to need those kalim, those vessels, the dishes and the cutlery and whatever, and even perhaps some of his bedding for that evening. And instead of having a house which is not prepared for the income of Yom Tov, he should do something lechovod Yom Tov, lechovod Shmini Atzeres. So there's a certain compromise here between not doing something to humiliate the Yom Tov, if you like, of Sukkot, and at the same time not missing out on the preparatory kavod Yom Tov for Shmini Atzeres. So the compromise is that he's likely to move his kalim out of the sukkah, not dismantle the sukkah, and he can move them into the house in preparation so that when Yom Tov comes in, Shmini Atzeres night comes in, they're already available in the dining room or in the kitchen or whatever. All those preparations that we've just mentioned here, bringing the kalim in, is in order to fulfill the mitzvah kavod Yom Tov. There is such a mitzvah kavod Yom Tov, just as there is kavod Shabbos. These are preparatory things you do before Shabbos, before Yom Tov, to show that you're preparing yourself, you're zealous for the Yom Tov that's about to come in. And he's allowed to take down his kalim from the sukkah, which he's going to use in the house. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Mishnah seems like a very, very straightforward statement. The Gemara, as it always does, will slightly complicate the Mishnah because it doesn't want you to go home to think the Mishnah is just a simple walkover. It isn't a simple walkover. So the Gemara starts, Ein lo kalim lahorid mahu. First of all, the Gemara asks the question, which is going to be scoffed at as being totally ridiculous, and then reinterpret the question. Again, you imagine all this dialogue going on within itself almost in the Gemara, possibly as a transaction of the way in which the yeshiva conversations went in Bovel, when, as we know, when you talk to each other, there are always misunderstandings. There are misunderstandings between husband and wife, and there are misunderstandings when it comes to analyzing a piece of Mishnah. And there are misunderstandings when it comes to the way in which a question is expressed. So the question that was asked was, if he hasn't got any kalim to take down from the sukkah, what should he do? Well, and the simplest answer would be, if he hasn't got any kalim to take down from the sukkah to bring into the house, he doesn't take them down. And therefore the Gemara says, what a stupid question. It's also stupid because everybody has got some kalim in the sukkah. Ain't no kalim, says the Gemara. What do you mean? If a person theoretically doesn't have kalim in the sukkah to take down, what should he do? He has been living 7 days in the sukkah. Presumably, if he's been sleeping there, he has bedding. Presumably, if he's been eating there, he has some sort of stuff that he left in the sukkah. I mean, you might just answer that he's taken that stuff in already. But the Gemara doesn't believe that there is absolutely nothing for an individual to take in from the sukkah. There must always be something that he has to take in from the sukkah. So what do you mean when you ask the question if he hasn't got any kalim in the sukkah? So the Gemara says, Ella, no, that's not the question I meant to pose to you. It wasn't meant to be a stupid question. This is the question. Ein lo makom lo horid kalav mahu. Actually, it's a slightly different question. It sounds different. The question is this: if he's got nowhere to take his kalim into, what should he do? Completely different question. This guy's got kalim, and those kalim are in the sukkah. However, he's doing a shipputzim in his house at the moment, so he can't live in the house. His house was struck. It was repossessed by the bailiffs. I don't know what could have happened, because normally if you have a sukkah, you have a house as well. This guy's now homeless, and he has to stay in the sukkah even for Shmini Atzeres, because he's got nowhere to take the kelim into. In fact, he's got to leave them where they are. So what should he do on the seventh day of Yom Tov? So what's the question then? Leave them where they are. That the question over here is the possibility it would look like Baal Tosif. It looks as though you're adding an 8th day to Sukkot. Everyone else, after 7 days of Sukkot, has gone into their home, right? They're not in the Sukkah anymore. And they're probably quite happy because they've got air conditioning, whatever it is to go into. This guy, on the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, nothing to the Sukkah, no Lulav and Esrog. He's still sitting in the Sukkah, he's eating the Sukkah, he's sleeping in the Sukkah. I mean, what does it look like? The Mefarshim make clear over here, we're not really worried about the violation of Baal Tosif, not adding a mitzvah to the Torah, because nobody would say that if a person was homeless and had nowhere else to go to, and he has to be in the sukkah because it's the only place he can eat and sleep, that he can be really thought of physically violating a mitzvah min Torah, because his kavanah is certainly not for that at all, and his kavanah counts. His intention is simply to find somewhere to be. To say that he's in violation, given his tragic situation, would be ridiculous. The problem here is one of Maris Ayin. And Maris Ayin is always a force to contend with as well. Other people will see him remain in his sukkah. They may not know that he's got the Shiputznikim into his house, and therefore he can't take his stuff in, and he has to remain in the sukkah. They see him there, and they think he's trying to be frummer than the Pope, so to speak. He wants to stay in the sukkah. He's enjoyed 7 days so much that he wants to extend the sukkahs into the 8th day. Again, the question is always asked, why are we worried about people suspecting you of doing something when you're not doing it? Shouldn't they mind their own business? And anyway, shouldn't they always be don lachafsachus? This question is always asked, and the answer is always the same. Yes, Maris Ayin is one of those strange halachot, which says that if you do something which somehow leads people to thinking that you're violating a mitzvah, there is a problem. Maris Ayin doesn't appear everywhere, and sometimes there's something called soft Maris Ayin, and there's hard Maris Ayin. There's some cases which the Mishnah quotes as being Maris Ayin, and then there are all sorts of cases which you can extend everything into. Everything you do in life could be considered Maris Ayin. Every time I walk out into the street, you could say, somebody would say, why are you walking? It's a beautiful day, I've decided to walk. Well, you're being Mavatal Torah. It's Bittul Torah. Maris Ayin. You could bring Maris Ayin into almost every activity. We don't normally do that. And yet, over here, there is some concern that after 7 days of Yom Tov, the guy remains in the sukkahs. There is some shmek here, if you like, some sense of Maris Ayin going over here. So what should he do? This guy, he's stuck in the sukkah. We know he's stuck in the sukkah. He's confronted with Maris Ayin. How does he get away from not making Maris Ayin? So the Gemara gives you here some answers. These are, if you like, eitzes. What does this person do to prevent Maris Ayin? You know, the nosy neighbor thinking this guy is trying to be frummer than everyone else, so he should do this. So we've got a couple of answers. Rav Chia bar Ashi Omar. Rav Chia bar Ashi, an Amora, he answered that this is what he should do. Poches ba arba. Which means 4 tfachim. Arba what? 4 tfachim. It's just missing over here. Arba. He should make a gap in his schach. Maybe it means a line all the way from one side of the sukkah to the other of 4 tfachim in width. An air gap, or a gap filled with, I don't know, put a plank in it or whatever it is. In other words, he has to move the schach away in such a way that he makes his sukkah pasul. And it has to be visible. If you make your sukkah pasul in a very subtle manner, nobody knows it's pasul, you're left with Maris Ayin. Even if it's pasul, people think it's kosher. So you do something to make your sukkah look pasul. And that's all he has to do. And then it's not going to be any Maris Ayin. People will walk by and they'll say, oh, he's sitting in the sukkah. Oh, yes, but look, half the roof is off. So he's doing so for whatever reason. Maybe he likes it there. Or maybe his house is unlivable and there is no Maris Ayin. So that's the solution from Rav Chia bar Ashi, that he should open it up for tfachim in the roof, so he passes the schach. And that's not going to be an aveira on Yom Tov either. Just moving some of the leaves away, it's the 7th day of Yom Tov, isn't going to be a problem. The schach, anyway, we're coming towards the end of the day, we allow him to do it. Another answer. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Omar, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, another early Amora, he says the following. This is his eitzah.
not to open the schach. He's got a stranger eitzah, which the Gemara later on is going to challenge, and we'll see it challenge it later on. Madlik ba'es haner. He takes his candelabra, his candlestick, or whatever, his oil lamp, or whatever he had at the time. He takes it into the sukkah and he lights it there while he eats. What do we mean? What he's saying over here is based upon a Gemara, which we probably learned about 2.5 years ago, which is that you shouldn't really bring your candelabrum, your lit candelabrum, into the sukkah. Now there, when the Gemara mentions it, it is qualified, and they say it depends how big the sukkah is. If it's a very small sukkah, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, then he shouldn't do it, because first there's a risk of fire, and there's a risk, and also it would smell bad. Don't forget that oil lamp. So in a restricted small sukkah, it actually fouls up the sukkah. So if you want to live and show your enthusiasm and joy in the sukkah, you don't bring in something foul smelling. So you should leave the lit candles in the house or on a table outside or whatever, and not bring them into the sukkah. That was the eitzah in the Gemara much, much earlier on. Says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, what does this man do on the end of the 7th day to show that he, even though he's staying in the sukkah, he's not doing so anymore because it's Sukkot? He brings his candelabrum in. How does that help? It stops Marisain. It's a bit subtle, right? Normally, a person passing by, your nosy neighbor, will see you in the sukkah, and you won't have a candelabrum. Why? Because it's Sukkot. And there's a halacha that says leave the candelabrum outside. At the end of the 7th day, you're allowed to bring your candelabra inside dafka to show that even though you're in the sukkah, you're not subject to the halachas of sukkah anymore. Yes, you can. When it comes to your own garden shed, you can bring a candelabrum in on July the 13th. No one's going to say there's a halacha against it. If you want to set fire to your sukkah and sit in a foul-smelling situation, you can. And this guy, therefore, brings his menorah in dafka, because during sukkahs he's not allowed to. When he marches proudly his candelabra into the sukkah, he's making a show of the fact that he's now going to sit in the sukkah, not for the purposes of Sukkot, because it would otherwise be asur for him to do it this way, but rather as he has nowhere else to go, so he brings his candelabrum in. So that's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's solution. Later on, the Gemara is going to say this is not a very good solution, because the prohibition against the menorah is only for a tiny sukkah. So it'll only work for a tiny sukkah. If you've got a bigger sukkah, you do bring your candelabrum in the sukkah, and we do nearly all the time. So to say you march your candelabrum in, you're not marching it anywhere. It's there all the time. The Gemara will ask that question over later on. So we just have to, we'll bear in mind that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's answer is a bit problematic. So we've had two solutions. What do you do before the 8th day comes in? You're forced to remain in the sukkah for whatever reason, but to demonstrate the fact that you know it's not Sukkot anymore, and you want to show everyone that you're not violating Baal Tosif, you have to make some distinction. So the first distinction that Rabbi Chia bar Ashi brought was to make this gap in the schach, which passes the schach, and it's therefore visible to everyone that you have a posel sukkah, and therefore you're not continuing Sukkot. The second answer we've just given is to deliberately bring in your candelabrum, which you would not normally do on Sukkot, and therefore people know Sukkot is over, and you're just bringing it in, and you're living in it like you would live on it as a summer house or whatever it is. But the Gemara now says, velo pligi, these two amaram, these two solutions are not at odds with each other. Sometimes the Gemara will say that, where you have two chachamim and they bring different solutions to a problem. Sometimes it is because they don't agree with each other's solutions. Yes, so Rabbi A will say this, and Rabbi B will say that, because Rabbi A doesn't accept the that, and Rabbi B doesn't accept the this. They've got their own unique answers. They have reasons why they believe the other guy's solution isn't appropriate. The Gemara says here there's no argument really between Rav Chia bar Ashi, where he says you open up for tfachim in the schach, and Rabbi Shimon ben Levi says no, you bring your candelabrum in. It's not that they disagree with each other at all. There's a different reason why they each bring a different solution, and that reason is based upon
where they are, who they're speaking to, who their audience is. Let's see how this works. The Gemara now explains. Halon v'halahu, which is not very explicit. One is speaking to us, and one is speaking to them. Which one's speaking to us, and which one's speaking to them? Why doesn't the Gemara explain itself, for goodness sake? Okay, so what's the meaning of one is speaking to us? One of these two sages, in saying that you open up your schach, is speaking to us, and the other one's speaking to them. So the way the Mefarshim understand it, the one is speaking to us is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Matlik bo es haner, that you have to bring the camera in. Why is that? And they explain, Rashi explains the reason is, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was talking to Lon, us. Who's us? Talmud Bavli. Where's Bavli? Bavel. Remember, we're not talking about it. This is the Gemara. When Talmud Yerushalmi, then the Gemara is in Eretz Yisrael as well. But we're in Talmud Bavli, so the Gemara is in Bavel. So the one who's speaking to us, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that's the way they explain it, although it's not obvious, is speaking to us. He says the only solution is to bring a menorah in. Why is the only solution to bring a menorah in? Because us in Bovel, if you like, in Chutz La'aretz, if we adopted the other solution, it would not work. Because the other solution was to open up the schach, yes, to passel the sukkah. But if you're on Chutz La'aretz, you are not allowed to do that on Shmini Atzeres. We said before, earlier on, that in Chutz La'aretz, you sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. You don't make a bracha, remember? You sit in it, but don't make a bracha. But because it's a suffix, the seventh day. In a sense, you know, formally, there's a suffix. The Shmini Atzeres isn't actually a day of Sukkot itself, the last of the seventh day of Sukkot. So you sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So there's no way you can make a hole in your sukkah, sit in it in Shmini Atzeres and say, you know what, I'm sitting in the sukkah. You're not sitting in a sukkah at all. If it's a suffix seventh day, you have violated Sukkot, at least as far as a suffix is concerned. In a suffix, you violated Sukkot, because you have to have a kosher sukkah, even if it's a suffix. You can't have a treif sukkah just because it's suffix. Either you know it isn't Sukkot, or you think it is. If there is a doubt it might be Sukkot, this is the idea of Shmini Atzeres and Chutz La'aretz, then you have to be in a kosher sukkah. So clearly on the seventh day, towards the end of the seventh day, you would not have the option of opening up the gap in the schach. That will work for Eretz Yisrael. That solution works for Eretz Yisrael because on Eretz Yisrael, the eighth day is Shmini Atzeres proper, and there's no din of sukkah. So then you open up the schach, and that's fine. But in Chutz La'aretz, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's Madlik Ba'as Haner is talking about Chutz La'aretz, that's the only solution, because you can't open up the sukkah. So what are you going to do? You've got to keep a kosher sukkah, and you're going to be there on Shmini Atzeres, Maris Ayin. So the answer is you bring the candlestick in. So if one had, it depends where you live and who you're talking to, what answer you're going to give over here. They don't disagree. This depends upon circumstances. In Bovel, they only had one option. That option was to bring the candlestick in. That's how the Gemara is answering. In Eretz Yisrael, the better option than the candlestick was to move your schach aside so that it wasn't, so you had a posel sukkah and everyone saw you had a posel sukkah. Everything's nice and dandy over here. You have two different answers and they suit different communities, and different communities need to have their own solutions. As we see over here, there is no machlokas. It's just a matter of where you are. There's a small problem in this, which is actually a big problem, but it's a small problem as far as learning the Gemara. It's a big problem as far as history is concerned and geography, and the Rishonim grapple with this. The Gemara is just, the way we've understood it, the whole Holon, that's Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and he was speaking to people of Bovel, and he said, Madlik bar es haner. The only solution is you can't break the sukkah, because in Bovel, we still sit in the sukkah on the eighth day. You can't break it. So therefore, it has to be to bring the candlesticks in. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is giving that. Bring the candlesticks in, because we're in Chutz La'aretz. Rav Chia bar Ashi says, no, he says, I'm speaking for Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, you can open up the schach, because we don't sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So therefore, you can easily open up the schach, and that's fine. Here's the problem. It's pinkt verkehrt. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi lived in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Chia bar Ashi lived in Bavel. So we've got the solutions being postulated by the wrong person. It should be Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi who says, open up the schach. He lived in Eretz Yisrael. He could open up the schach. Rav Chia bar Ashi, we know, by Rav actually could be, he lived in Bavel, and therefore his solution should have been to carry in the candelabrum. So why are the wrong person giving the solution over here? What's happened over here? Well, you can say we've got the names mixed up. We don't like to say we've got the names mixed up. So the Mefarshim all give this reason, and it's a reason which is given in a few situations actually in the Gemara where a similar thing happens, where it seems that a Gemara, a Tana or an Amora in Eretz Yisrael is giving a solution that fits Bavel, and a Tana or Amora in Bavel is giving a solution that fits Eretz Yisrael. And we don't know why, because normally you expect these rabbis to be speaking to their own communities, not to be speaking to the opposite side, if you like. So the answer that is given, if you like it, is that yes, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was living in Eretz Yisrael. So how can he be speaking to Lon? How can he be speaking to the Babylonians by saying this? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi had a yeshiva, and in his yeshiva there were Babylonians who'd come to study. So he was telling them what to do, not for himself. He was telling them what to do, right? This was like one of these international universities. Now we have these here in Eretz Yisrael as well. All the Chutznikim come in. So Rabbi Shimon ben Levi had a yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, but he was lecturing to Babylonians who were going to go back to Bavel. They come to Eretz Yisrael because they wanted to learn Torah's Eretz Yisrael. And therefore he gave them that advice. When you go back to Bavel, what you can do is you have to bring in your candlestick. Not for him, Rabbi Shimon ben Levi can open the sukkah, but the people he's lecturing to are Babylonian students. And what about the other way around? You've got to say the other thing as well. In Bavel, Rav Chia bar Ashi was lecturing to Eretz Yisraeli students. Yeah, people go to Chutz La'aretz because they want to go to a fancy university in America or something like that, or to learn medicine in Budapest or something. So you have over here, you have Eretz Yisraelim Rabbonim, or training, or Talmidei Chachamim, who are going to Bavel, one of the fine academies, Babylonian academies, in order to learn there. So Rav Chia bar Ashi, who was in Bavel, is giving an answer that to the Eretz Yisrael Rabbonim, or the Eretz Yisrael Talmidim, who are going to go back to Eretz Yisrael, and he says, you can open up your sukkah. And that will explain why it seems that each rabbi is giving a contrary message to his own place of birth, because each of them have got students from the other side. It's interesting if you read it like this. And indeed, there is, if you look at the Gemara, certainly we talked about many times, the Amoram who would go up and down between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. They had certain names, they were famous, they made long journeys. There was a constant interchange at the time of the Amoram, certainly between the Yerushalmi scholars, if you like, and the Babylonian scholars. And if you look at Talmud Yerushalmi, you find many of the halakhic statements there are from the Babylonian school. And in Talmud Bavli, a lot of the scholars refer to Amoram and Eretz Yisrael. Well, how do they all know what the other ones were thinking? And it's because they were interchanging so much. So we had an international exchange of scholarship from the very earliest times. This is well before the Rhodes Scholar came into the United States, you know, where they send people to Oxford or whatever it is. So this was the situation. This is the way they understand it. They were each speaking to scholars from the other country. Okay, okay, the Gemara is now going to challenge a question that I already brought in ahead of the time, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's Eitzah of lighting a small menorah. Bringing the candelabrum into the sukkah. That's what he said you needed to do, and we said that's what you need to do in Bavel, because there you can't open up the schach because you need to sit another day on Shmini Atzeres even without a bracha. So the only thing you can do to show is to bring the menorah in. So that's what he said. The Gemara is going to say, I don't understand that solution. This is a half-baked solution of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's. It doesn't work. Hartinach sukkah katana. It works for a sukkah katana. I said to you that the whole prohibition against bringing in your candelabrum into the sukkah is only in place for a smaller sukkah. And Rashi says that we're talking about the minimum sized sukkah or something near the minimum sized sukkah. Do you know how small the minimum size sukkah? You remember it was 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim, almost something smaller than a telephone booth, or maybe the size of a telephone booth in terms of floor area. That's about 28 inches by 28 inches, enough that you could bring your chair in, a tray on your lap, and you won't have your back protruding through the empty wall. You probably have 3 walls here anyway. How are you going to get into a sukkah like this? You'd have to slither in otherwise. So that's the minimum sukkah. That is the situation where you should not bring a candelabrum in. But for you sukkah gadola ma'ikalamema, most people are not in this minimalist sukkahs, so don't give me a solution that only works for 1 in a million people. Most people have a sukkah bigger than that. In a sukkah bigger than that, you're allowed to bring your candelabrum in anyway, because it's not considered to be. The foul smell isn't going to make you unconscious or whatever it is in the larger volume of airspace. So you're allowed to bring it in. If you're allowed to bring it in even on sukkahs, then bringing it in on the end of sukkahs isn't going to make a distinction for Shmini Atzeres. So how are you going to make your distinction? You haven't solved the problem for the majority of the world. It's not a distinction to bring in the candelabrum for any sukkah other than the minimum sukkah. So the Gemara gives another answer. It's not going to work with the menorah, bringing it in for a normal size sukkah. How are you going to make it obvious that you're sitting on the 8th day, but you're not sitting because you wish to carry on the mitzvah of sukkah, but rather because you've nowhere else to go? So he says something. There are many possible solutions to this. Why have we got so stuck on the menorah and and the schach? So here we have another common sense solution. You can bring in, I love this one, the dirty dishes. Into the sukkah, you bring in the dirty dishes. How does that help, bringing the dirty dishes towards the end of the 7th day of Yom Tov? Let's go on and read it. To Amar Rava, because Rava said the following: Mane meichla, the dirty dishes, which means that dishes that you've already eaten in, and you haven't washed them up yet. It may not be so dirty, but they're greasy. Bar mibit talalta. You should always remove them from the sukkah on Sukkot, because the sukkah has got to be pristine, because this is the place you're making your colonial home. Yes, during the year you eat at home and you live like a baron and king and whatever it is, royalty in your home. On Sukkot, you're supposed to make your sukkah royalty, fit for a king, and a king doesn't have dirty dishes on his table. It's Sukkot, and therefore you've got to take out those dirty dishes. But let's just carry on. Mani mishtaya, but glasses which you've drunk with, bim talalta, you're allowed to keep in the sukkah. Talalta is a funny reference here to being in the sukkah, but dirty dishes you shouldn't keep in the sukkah. So this is what you do. Normally, when you finish eating, now this is very good, you have to remember this next time for sukkahs, you should move the dirty dishes out of the sukkah as quickly as possible. Right? In the same way as you might do in your smart dining room. The smart dining room, you don't keep the greasy, meaty plates on the table for very long. You take them off, then you bring the compote, then you take the compote off, and you might then sweep a few crumbs off. And you should do the same in the sukkah normally for Sukkot. However, dafka on the 7th day and into the 8th day when you're in the sukkah, and you want to demonstrate that you're not sitting in the sukkah for the purposes of Sukkot, you should mess up. Well, that's what the Mishnah is telling you. I'm only telling you what the Gemara is telling you. You should mess up, because the din of keeping your sukkah pristine has to do with Sukkot, because it's now the place you really want to live. This is not an easy answer, by the way. Shmini Atzeres is also a Yom Tov. Who says you want to have dirty kelim on the table? But the need to make the, if you like, the ambience so smart and delicate and refined isn't the same as it is on Sukkot. Because in Sukkah, you're in the Sukkah and you're trying to treat it as your main home, right? You leave the home into the Sukkah, off come the dirty dishes. During Yom Tov, you can be a bit more relaxed because you're not sitting in the sukkah because you're trying to make this your royal place. It isn't anymore. It's just the only place you've got. So you can leave those dirty dishes on. This is very cute in a sense, because how does this stop Marisayin? How does it stop Marisayin? Your nosy neighbor is going to have to stick his nose in the sukkah to see whether you've got your dirty dishes in there. When it comes to the candelabrum, you can see the light burning. So a guy can say, oh, he's brought his candelabrum in, or he can see a hole in the srach. How is he going to see the dirty dishes? That's a question for the audience. I don't really know the answer to that question. It seems to me a very weak way of demolishing Marisayin. You almost have, I think it's easier perhaps to put a note on the side of the wall of the sukkah saying, I have nowhere else to go. That's my answer. This whole Mishnah would be unnecessary. Yeah, you just stick a note on, I have nowhere else to go, and that's why I'm in the sukkah. And that completely destroys Marisayin. But if that were the answer, we wouldn't have had all the interesting Gemara and discussion we've had so far, so we would have lost out. Okay. We have now got to the next Mishnah, Nisuch Hamayim, a complete change of pace, a complete change of topic. This is one that we've dealt with before. In fact, I even quoted a big extract from this Mishnah before, because in the context of an earlier discussion, it was necessary to know what we were talking about. And the Gemara there was impatient and just brought up the subject of Nisuch Hamayim, which is the water libation during the 7 days of Yom Tov of Sukkot, Sha'afta Mayim idea, Beis HaShoeva, the drawing ceremony is part of the same thing, the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. So we have previously looked at some of this discussion. And I'm going to start from this Mishnah. I'm actually going to share my screen with you because I previously actually showed you this. You'll remember this extremely well, because everyone on my share group has extraordinarily strong memory. Where does it start? So that was Nisuch Hamayim Ketzad. Our Mishnah starts, I mean, you can read it on the screen if you want to, and you have an illustrated version of the Gemara if you read from the screen, or if you wish to continue reading from your daf sheet, it's up to you. We know that there's a mitzvah of Nisuch Hamayim, this water libation, all 7 days of Sukkot. The Mishnah over here describes for us, almost from first principles, what it's all about. So even though we're towards the end of the Masechta and we have brought up the mitzvah of Nisuch Hamayim many times in earlier dafim, you really have to wait to the end to know what it's talking about, parts of the way in which there's no beginning and no end to Talmud Bavli. Everywhere is a beginning, everywhere is an end. So the Mishnah starts here, Nisuch Hamayim Ketzad. I've got those in small print over here, Nisuch Hamayim Ketzad. Am I sharing? Yes, I am sharing. Oh, for a moment, I thought I was just reading my own screen. So, Tzeluchas shel Zohav mecheskas mechazekas shloshes lugim hoyamamale min hasheluach. It's the first few words in the Mishnah. Flasks of gold, which would hold 3 lugim. 3 lugim is a quantity. It's about 2 pints. In current volume terms, right? A fairly substantial, but not an enormous amount of water. Those flasks of that volume were brought down from Mei HaShiluach, from the Shiluach pool. They were filled at the Shiluach pool, and then they were going to be brought up again. If you're over here, I showed you the Shiluach pool. This is in the Ir David nowadays, and up the hill, right at the top of the hill, you can see that's the Beis HaMikdash at the top of the hill. As we know now, when you're David, you're going right down to Shluch Pool to the base, and then you've got to go all the way up to reach the Har Habayis. So the Kohanim, or maybe not the Kohanim, even ordinary people would come down and they would fill their golden flasks. You can see them over here just about, I think, filling their flasks from the pool, trumpeters around them. There was a great ceremony. Higia l'shah hamayim. Then they would take that water in the flasks, march it up with, as I say, in great ceremony towards the Har Habayis, having filled those flasks. Toku v'hariu v'toku.
they did tekiah, teruah, tekiah, literally. But it doesn't mean that precisely. It means that they blew and they sung and they blew trumpets. They didn't blow. These are not shofars that we have for Rosh Hashanah, but they use the same lashon of toku, which is to blow any, if you like, in any wind instrument. And they were blowing trumpets. You can see, maybe if I just make this bigger. Look at that. You can see the golden trumpets over here. Isn't that wonderful? And you can see their flasks they're filling now a little bit more clearly. I'm sorry I haven't got this in the form of a motion video. I'll try and get one next time. So toku ve'riva toku, ola ba'kevesh ufana l'smol. They would go up to the Mizbeach, and then when they reached the top, and they would turn left. Shnei safalim shel kesef hayusham. And there were 2 buckets, if you like, of silver there. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we'll look at a picture in a moment. Rabbi Yehuda said, Shel sid hayu. They were not of silver. These buckets on the top of the Mizbeach, on the roof of the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, were not of silver. They were actually of sid. They were actually like of lime, of pottery. Mushcharin panehem mipnei hayayin, but they'd been used for wine, and they were already, if you like, discolored. So they looked somewhat silvery, but they were not actually silver. Umenukovin kamin shnei chutmin dakin, and they had these buckets, not the flasks that they took the water from the pool, but the buckets on the Mizbeach had holes in the bottom, and they had 2 narrow ducts. One bucket had a thicker duct hole, and the other one had a thinner duct hole. So that the flow through them down into the Mizbeach would finish at the same time. The western one was of water, and the eastern one of wine. So let's have a look over here. See this beautiful picture over here, which I took myself nearly 2,000 years ago. What you see, the flasks that they're carrying in their hands are the flasks which were filled. No, let's start again. This is the flask that's filled with water, which is going to go into the western, if you like, this pool. This is the flask that was filled with wine, which is going to go into this bucket, that bucket, and this bucket. Actually, there's very, very naughty. This Temple Institute picture should show these as being silver. We just said that these are like buckets. They really would be much bigger than these flasks. The scaling isn't quite right. They should be silver. These are gold. These should both be silver. Imagine they're silver. And he's pouring his water from the shiloach into this bucket. And this Cohen is pouring a wine decanter, libation wine into this. What you don't see is that at the base of these receptacles, there is a hole, and that hole feeds into a channel into the Mizbeach, so that the water is not going to fill up this receptacle. It's going to pass through the hole in the bottom, which you can't see, on the base. Similarly, the wine is going to pass through a hole at the bottom of this receptacle. Wine is more viscous and flows more slowly. So the receptacle that is going to carry the wine has a wider aperture hole at the bottom than the receptacle that's going to carry the water. And the chokhmah is that the ratio of the 2 diameters is such that both the water and the wine would empty out from the 2 receptacles at the same time. So someone had done a scientific experiment to see how much bigger the wine hole needs to be than the water hole, such that the wine will empty here through the base into a channel just at the same time as the water, which is much less viscous and travels much more quickly, would empty through a hole at the base of this receptacle. So this was the water libation simultaneous to a wine libation, right? So the water libation takes place during Sukkot. There were wine libations all the time,
during the year as well. A lot of korbanos needed wine libations as well. But the water libation, if you like, was a sukkos type chidush, and it was taken up from the shiluach pool. Okay. So let me just carry on. I'm going to carry on now in the Mishnah itself on the daf sheet because I haven't taken it further on my diagram form. Right, Kadesho Shneim Colin Bavasacha, so that both of them should finish emptying out simultaneously. That was the two holes would be so ratioed in their aperture. So Lemarovo Shalmaim, the Mishnah said, Lemizrocho, on the eastern side of wine. Okay. Now, the Mishnah is telling you what happens if something goes wrong. And the Mishnah sometimes does this, and you pour the wrong one into the wrong receptacle. You've gone up there, and someone's told you to turn left or turn right, and you've turned right instead of left, or left and turn of right. So that's the Mishnah's going to deal with it straight away. Ira, that should, if you imagine in Hebrew, it should say im ira. If it happened that ira, he poured shel mayim, the water flask contents, l'soch shel yayin, into the receptacle that was intended for the wine, like over here on this picture, right? Shel ira shel mayim, l'soch shel yayin, or shel yayin, l'soch shel mayim, or he started to pour the wine, but he poured it into the water receptacle instead. So they made a flip-flop here by mistake, clearly. Then Yotza, says the Mishnah, he is Yotza. In other words, the water and the wine libations are considered to be valid, even though he's done something wrong. There are certain ceremonials which are considered to be ma'akev. You've got to get them exactly right. Otherwise, we say it hasn't worked, start again. There are other processes and rituals which are not ma'akev, which means even though lechatchila, you should do them in a certain way, b'diavad, if you didn't do them a certain way, it doesn't invalidate the process. And according to this opinion, it doesn't invalidate the process if the Kohen poured his contents into the wrong receptacle. However, let's now read the next piece. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Balog hoya menasech kol shemona." This has nothing to do with this mistake. This is here he argues actually on a different point with our essentially the way we've understood the Mishnah previously. Previously, we said that the quantity of water was 3 log. Yes, right at the beginning of the Mishnah, we said machazeket shlosha lugim, which I said was about 2 pints. That was the opinion of the first statement in the Mishnah. And also, according to that opinion, the Nisuch Mayim, the water libation ceremony, took place only during the 7 days of Sukkot, but not on Shmini Atzeres. On both of these points, Rabbi Yehuda himself is going to dispute. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Balog, the volume contained in these flasks of water from the Shiluach was only 1 log, less than a pint. It did not need to be 3 log. That's the first thing he disagrees with. And second, he said, Hoyo menasech kol shemona, all 8 days, according to Rabbi Yehuda, not according to the, if you like, the unnamed Tana, who we really follow in halacha. Rabbi Yehuda is a minority opinion, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, the libation ceremony was carried out even on Shmini Atzeres, not just on the 7th day, but also on the 8th day. So he argues on 2 points. 1, the volume of water required, where he says 1 log and not 3. And 2, that it's also, the ritual takes place on Shmini Atzeres and not just on the 7th day of Sukkot. 7 days of Sukkot. Just a historical aside over here. How can there be an argument on what the rules were in the temple? Are we not dealing here with a Mishnah? And therefore, are we not dealing here with early sages? And therefore, should they not have been aware what was going on? Would there not be thousands of people who had seen this, these events? Would there not be a bunch of Kohanim everywhere who would say, is it 1 log, is it 3? Did they do it on Shmini Atzeres or not?
If they did on Shmini Atzeres, do you think there could be an argument? How can one side say they didn't do it on Shmini Atzeres and the other side say they did? Okay, so the answer here, and sometimes we need to think about how the sages match up to the various contents of a particular Mishnah. Here we're talking about the Beis Hamikdash. There are early Tanoim who were alive during the Beis Hamikdash, but the majority of Tanoim actually lived after Chorban HaBayis, or were very young during the period of the Bayis Sheni. And therefore, they would not have had direct witness of the ritual and how it took place in the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehuda over here, for example, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi, so he was probably born about 100 in the Common Era. And he was probably, if you like, a Talmud Chacham of the year, around the year 130, 150, around that period. So when he was born was 30 years after Chorban Bayis Sheni. So there was no direct witness, probably by the time he was, 50 years later, there might have been a few very elderly Kohanim or whatever about, but maybe not even, because the trauma of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash would have dislocated very many people. And Rabbi Yehuda also would have lived through probably the Bar Kokhba revolt. So these were very, very turbulent times. So he may well have not had any direct evidence. He would have had Maseret, a tradition. Under those circumstances, there is room for dispute, because the first tradition is that the water libation was brought only 7 days and not the 8th day. And the second tradition, and the other side is was brought the 8th day. That's Rabbi Yehuda. There was a tradition, it was 3 log. And there was another tradition, which Rabbi Yehuda's quoted, that it was 1 log. So under those circumstances, we can see how there can be disputes. You can see even nowadays that, how truth is distorted and how quickly. We talk about Holocaust denial 100 years later, when we have the most extraordinary level of communications capacity, of historical testimonials, of videos, of everything, and you can still deny very, very many events. So in order to recollect the detail without all of that, it's not so simple. It's not surprising when it comes to the detail of Mikdash ritual that there are differences of opinion. Okay. We're going to carry on now. This Mishnah actually gives us, if you like, a fly on the wall view of how the Nisuch HaMayim ceremony took place. And again, this would be the tradition reported, because this is probably not the eyewitness testimonial in some recorded history book. So says the Mishnah, V'lama naseich omrim lo, to the libator, they would say, what does that mean? It means presumably the people witnessing the libation ceremony, possibly the Kohanim, at that part of the Mizbeach, I think so Yisraelim would have been able to come there as well. So whoever was witnessing it, they said to the libator, Hagbe yodacha, raise up your hand at the time you pour the water into the receptacle on the Mizbeach. Raise up, what do I mean raise up? Raise up the flask. Actually, we saw in that picture, we saw how the Kohanim was raising his hand. Raise it up high so everyone can see. Why? Because shepam echad nisach echad al gabe raglov. On one occasion, a Kohen deliberately simply emptied out the contents on his toes rather than into the receptacle. He had the flask of water libation and he emptied it out on his toes and not into the receptacle in order to sabotage the process. Sabotage. Urigamuhu kala ambes rogehen. And all the people watching, they managed to catch a glimpse of this, and they stoned him with their esrogim. It's Sukkos, right? And they happened to have their Lulav Nesrog at the time, and that Cohen was knocked off his feet by all the audience who saw what he was doing. From then on, they made it a requirement that any Cohen doing the ceremony should make it very clear what he's doing and that he's conforming with Pharisaic tradition.
What are we talking about over here? This is one of the situations where, unfortunately, the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, wanted to muck up the ceremony. And because the water libation ceremony is not mefurish in the Torah, so it's not, I mean, they might have taken lulav and esrog, but when it came to the Nisuch HaMayim, there's no direct posuk in the Chumash that says that you are menasech mayim. And therefore, they treated that part of the ceremony with a bit of contempt. And in order to display their contempt, they would pour out the water to abuse, essentially abuse the ceremony. And this is what they would do. Why were they doing this? Because we find at that period, the Gemara says in more than one place as well, that many of the Kohanim were Tzedukim. The Tzedukim were very wealthy. They lived in the upper city. You go to the old city today, and many of them were actually Sadducees. And in fact, as the Gemara in Yuma says, some Kohanim Gedolim bought their way into the high priesthood by paying money, and they were Sadducees, and they wanted to carry out even the ceremony on Yom Kippur differently, on the holiest day of the year. So when a Sadducee Kohen got his turn, and somehow they were not stopped, maybe they were very powerful, they had a point. They were told that they needed to make it very clear that there was not up to any monkey business in distorting the ceremony of the Beis HaMikdash. So they actually instructed him to raise his hands up to make it clear what he was doing and that he was not abusing the ceremony. It's a remarkable thing we see in the Mishnah that here in the holiest part of the Jewish world, there was great suspicion cast against the Kohanic fraternity. In fact, they were the ones who were most to be suspected of Tzedukiot, of being Sadducees. They were very well-to-do, very many of them, and they'd become very well-to-do by being involved with the Romans, and they were not they were not scholars, but they managed to buy their way into the Beis HaMikdash. So this is what they said to him, so that we can see that the ritual is being carried out properly. The Mishnah goes on to say, "K'ma'aseu b'chol, kach ma'aseu b'Shabbos." Just as they performed the ritual during the weekdays, the Nisuch HaMayim, they would perform it also on Shabbos. They also libated into their receptacles on Shabbos, but there was a difference. Ella, Hayamamale me'erev Shabbos chavis shel zahav she'eino mekudeshes min hashiluach umaniach balishka. The thing, what they didn't do, they did not bring up the water from the shiluach pool on the Shabbos morning. Normally, on the morning, they would bring up the water up the hill and they would libate it on the Mizbeach. That very same day, they would bring the water up. But they did not do that on the Shabbos. The water libation had to be pre-prepared. Because of this risk that they would be carrying it through the Rishus HaRabim, they'd be carrying again. We see over here there was no Erev, or they didn't rely on an Erev, or whatever it is at that time. Carrying up the water from the Shiluach pool into the Beis HaMikdash would have been a violation of a carrying malacha on Shabbos. So they couldn't do it. So what did they do? On Erev Shabbos, they went down. Friday afternoon, they filled, if you like, a barrel of water from the libation pool in Shiluach. They brought it up and they put it into a chamber of the Beis HaMikdash. And then they took from that water on the Shabbos, and then they libated it onto the altar. But on a weekday, they would do it essentially, this whole ceremony would be done together, but essentially it was done in two parts. For libation on Shabbos. The bringing up was done on Erev Shabbos, and it was left there and used on Shabbos. The Mishnah adds a technical point over here. Maybe we discuss this a little bit next week, that it was the barrel was Eino Mekudeshes. Doesn't mean it's not married. I mean, it has the same terminology. It means that it was not a consecrated vessel. Every keli that was used in the Beis HaMikdash is normally pre-consecrated. Used to be done by the oil, you know, the oil which you would use to pour into it, which marked it out on as a vessel to be used for holy matters only. But even when there wasn't that particular oil, they would use it for a service, and once it'd been used, it was considered to be sanctified. A sanctified vessel, the contents you put into it have a different halacha to the contents you put into a non-sanctified vessel. The barrel they used was a non-sanctified vessel, which means it might have come from someone's home simply and was being used straight away. And that's the water they collected it in. I'll stop over here and we'll carry it on. I'll explain why that was done. It was to avoid a particular problem. And we will do the last few lines of the Mishnah again next week. So we spent most of our time on this Mishnah today. It's an interesting Mishnah, and it takes us through some of the scenery, if you like, of the Beis HaMikdash. I'm going to quit recording once I find the quit.